Blackwood Basin, Texas Territory. Summer, 1878. 40 armed riders circled the yard. On the porch, a widow stood alone, hands on the rail, chin level, staring down $1,000 bounty on her own head. Then the barn door swung open. A man stepped into the noon light. Slow, deliberate, hands loose at his sides. 3 hired guns dismounted. Started walking toward her. Montgomery's voice cut the heat like iron. Seize that woman and throw her off my land. The stranger didn't draw, didn't move. Just looked at the 3 men closing in, and when he spoke, even the horses went still. Take one more step. Not a single boot moved. This is the story of a woman who refused to be broken, a gunman carrying a blood-soaked past, and one spring of water worth dying for. Stay right here. The story starts now. The sun had no mercy that summer. It pressed down on Blackwood Basin like a flat hand against hot iron, burning everything it touched. The creek was mud and stones. The pasture had gone the color of straw in March and never recovered. Even the cottonwoods along the ridge had surrendered by July, their leaves spiraling down brown and papery into the dust before their time. Evelyn Callahan stood at her fence line with a shovel in one hand and baling wire in the other, and did not stop working. She was 28 years old. She stood 5'4" in her boots and carried herself with the steadiness of someone who had long since decided that hard times did not get to have the last word. Her hair was pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat. Her dress was patched at the hem. She was a former schoolteacher from back east who had followed her husband out west and then watched him die under circumstances. No sheriff had cared enough to investigate, and now she was here, running 80 acres alone with raw hands and a clear head. The Sweetwater spring at the back of the property still ran cold and clean through the rock. That was the whole game. Protect the spring, keep the cattle alive. Outlast the drought. She did it because no one else was going to. She looked over her shoulder at Eli. He sat in the shade near the porch steps, arranging small stones into a careful line on the ground. Slowly, one at a time like the order mattered. He was 7 years old and hadn't spoken a single word since the night his father died. The doctor in Abilene had said, trauma. Evie had nodded at that and paid the man, and then come home and gone back to work. Because sitting with grief forever was a luxury that only people without cattle understood. Lunch in an hour, she said. The soft scrape of a pebble on dry earth. That was his answer. She went back to the fence. The stranger arrived around noon. She heard the horse before she saw the man. A slow, labored clop on the road, the sound of an animal giving everything it had left to give. Then the dusty roan came into view, favoring its left foreleg badly. The man on its back was listing slightly, favoring one side. He wore a poncho the color of old sand and a hat pulled low against the glare. His right hand hung at his side, with a stillness that wasn't rest. When he got close enough, Evie could see the blood. It had soaked through his shirt below the shoulder and dried into a dark rust stain against the cloth. Not fresh, but not old enough to be forgiven either. He stopped at the gate. She kept the shovel in her hand and looked at him. Waited. Ma'am. His voice came out low and even, like gravel settling. My horse needs rest. Won't be long. He wasn't begging. He wasn't putting on a performance of helplessness. He was just stating what was true and leaving the decision to her. Evie looked at the roan. The animal's sides were heaving, foam at the bit. She looked at the man. He met her eyes and didn't look away, but he didn't push either. There's a trough by the barn, she said. Water him first. Then come up to the house. Something crossed his face. Not gratitude exactly, more a stillness. The expression of a man who had knocked on too many doors and genuinely didn't know how to reckon with one standing open. Cale Ross, he said. Evie Callahan. She was already walking toward the house. I'll get food on. She put beans on the stove and set cornbread out on the board. When he came to the back door, she had coffee hot and a plate ready. She cleaned his wound at the kitchen table while the beans finished heating. She worked with steady hands and a cloth she'd boiled clean, pressing the bandage firm against the damaged tissue. She did not ask how he'd gotten the wound. When a man rode in on a failing horse with a shoulder injury, he didn't offer to explain. You had a choice. You could demand the story, or you could help him. Demanding would have cost them both time, and told her nothing she needed to know. She'd already seen enough. He had watered the horse before he'd worried about himself. That said more than any story would. Eli sat across the table, through all of it, watchings. Brown eyes moved from the man's face, to his wrapped shoulder, to his hands around the coffee cup, and back again. Cale glanced at the boy once. He didn't push, didn't try to coax him out with cheerful noise or exaggerated friendliness. He just nodded at him, quiet and level, and went back to his beans. After a moment, Eli picked up a crumb from the table and set it precisely beside his spoon. Cale watched that and said nothing. I can work for my keep, Cale said, looking at Evie. Whatever you need done. I've fenced, done carpentry, hauled water. Fencing needs doing. She sat down across from him. Back past your post line is coming apart. And I need help hauling from the spring until we get rain. When's that? When God decides. She poured more coffee. Could be August, could be never, that's the West. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He'd been looking at the table. But he glanced up then, and there was a brief moment where their eyes held longer than was strictly necessary. Nothing loud about it. Nothing dramatic. Just two people, across a kitchen table, who had both seen enough hard country to recognize it in each other. Evie looked away first. Barns. Yours to sleep in, she said. Meals at 6 and noon. I run a working ranch, Mr. Ross, not a hotel. That suits me. He was halfway through the back pasture by the time Montgomery's men came up the road. 2 riders. One wore a pressed vest and carried himself like the vest was doing the work. The other was broad and heavy and quiet in the patient way of men who earned their money waiting for someone else to give an order. Evie walked off the porch and stood in the yard. Mrs. Callahan. The vested one smiled without using his eyes. Mr. Montgomery sends his regards. He's prepared to offer you $100 for this property. Cash in hand today. She let that sit for a second. $100. That's right. For 80 acres with a working spring. A house. Livestock. Given the drought. He gestured at the cracked earth, the struggling cattle, the empty sky, and your current situation. It's a generous offer. Tell Mr. Montgomery, she said, to keep his $100 and his regards both. This land is not for sale. The smile left. The big man moved his horse 2 steps forward, close enough that she could hear the leather creak. The barn door swung open. Cale came out slowly. No hurry. He walked into the afternoon light and stopped and stood with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the 2 men. That was all he did. But something shifted the second he stepped into view. The vested man's horse sidestepped for no reason. The big man's hand, which had been drifting toward his belt, went completely still. They looked at Cale, the way people look at something they had only heard about in stories, and now suddenly had to reckon with as a real and present fact. A name traveled with this man, a history made of real events, real towns, real men who had tested him and gone home quieter for it. Cale didn't speak. He didn't reach for anything. He stood in the sun and watched them and did not blink. The vested man cleared his throat. We'll pass along your answer, Mrs. Callahan. He was already pulling his horse around. Good day to you. They rode out hard. Evie stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then she turned. Cale was walking back to the barn. Mr. Ross. He stopped. Thank you, she said. He didn't turn around. He stood with his hand on the barn door. Quiet for a moment. Fences aren't finished, he said. Then he went inside. Eli had watched all of it from the porch steps. He looked at the road where the riders had gone. He looked at the barn door. Then he reached down and picked up one more stone from the dirt and placed it at the end of his long, careful line. The spring kept running at the back of the land, cold and clean through the rock, stubborn as the woman who owned it. The sun pressed down on everything it could reach. The day moved on. Evening was coming. It always came. 4 days passed. In those 4 days, Cale replaced 22 fence posts along the southern line, restrung the wire from the dead cottonwood all the way to the stone wall above the dry creek bed, and hauled 6 loads from the spring to keep the cattle through 3 afternoons of brutal, flat-handed heat. He didn't ask what needed doing each morning. He walked the property, saw what was failing, and handled it by order of urgency. The fence first, because the cattle couldn't be lost. The water hauls next, because without them, the cattle would die anyway. Small repairs after that, things that could wait but that he didn't let wait. Evie watched this from a distance. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't expect her to. Between them, trust was building the way good fence builds. One post at a time. Eli had stopped staying on the porch. He'd begun migrating toward wherever KL was working each morning, 20 or 30 feet back, never close enough to be underfoot or to make any kind of declaration about why he was there, just close enough to see every motion clearly. He'd watch Cale drive a post into the cracked earth and set the wire and bend and clip it tight, then move to the next one, methodical and unhurried. Cale never made a fuss about the boy's presence, never crouched down and put on the warm, oversized performance that adults sometimes did with quiet children, pushing and performing until the child went stiff under the pressure of it. He just worked. Occasionally, he set a spare nail down in the dirt nearby. Within reach, if Eli wanted it, Eli would pick it up, turn it over, set it back down, not helping yet. Learning what helping looked like. The morning of the 9th day, Evie was at the spring before the sun cleared the ridge. She did this most mornings now. She'd stand at the flat rock shelf where the water came through the limestone and just listen to it, cold and consistent. Most things in this valley were failing. The creek was dust and stones. 3 of the ranches to the west had sold out or gone under altogether, but the spring kept moving because it came from deep in the earth where the drought couldn't reach, and she kept moving for the same reason. You had to go deep enough, and you found the thing that surface conditions couldn't. Take. She was walking back toward the house, pail in hand, when she heard them. Not 2 riders. This had mass and intention. A carriage wheel under good weight. Horses moving in formation. She stopped and looked east. Thaddeus Montgomery came up the road on a big iron-gray stallion, with silver trim on the bridle worth more than a working hand made in a year. He rode with the posture of a man who had never once considered that a horse might not carry him. Behind him, 2 hired riders flanked the carriage, and just behind Montgomery came Sheriff Orson Pike on a blunt-faced bay, his freshly polished badge catching the morning light every few seconds with a dedicated persistence of something that badly wanted to be noticed. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Elian Marsh climbed out. She had bought baling wire from Elian Marsh's barn in an emergency last spring. She'd sat at his kitchen table, and his wife Agnes had given her coffee, and one of his boys had showed her a grasshopper he'd caught in his hat. She had thought on the walk home that they were good people, exactly what the frontier needed more of. Elian Marsh stood in her yard now and couldn't look at her. She set her pail on the porch step and waited. Montgomery dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who had never had to rush for anything. He adjusted his jacket. He came toward her with a folded document in his right hand and held it out less like an offer and more like a verdict. Mrs. Callahan. He let her name sit there for a breath. I believe we can resolve this situation quietly and reasonably if you're willing. Good morning, Mr. Montgomery, she said. He unfolded the document. What we have here is a recorded deed of sale filed with the Territorial Land Office. It confirms your voluntary transfer of the Blackwood Basin property and water rights to Montgomery Cattle and Land for consideration of $500, accepted in the presence of a witness on the 14th of May. She took it from him, unfolded it fully. Read it the way she used to grade work, line by line, without skipping, eyes steady. The date, the property description, the legal clause, the signature block. At the bottom, where her name should have been, was a large and clumsy X. I didn't sign this, she said. A witness will testify otherwise. Then your witness will lie under oath. She refolded the paper precisely along its creases and put it back in his hand. I have signed my full name in cursive since I was 11 years old. I was a school teacher for 6 years. My signature appears on this property's original deed, on my marriage license, on 6 years of employment contracts, and on every legal document I have touched since I arrived in this territory. I have never in my life made an X where a name belongs, and there is no judge in the territory who will look at that mark and at my actual signature and believe otherwise. Montgomery looked at Marsh. Mr. Marsh, state what you witnessed. Elian Marsh pressed both hands flat against his thighs. He stared at a point somewhere past Evie's left ear. A muscle in his jaw pulled and worked. On the 14th of May, he said, his voice coming out rough and low, like something dragged over gravel, I witnessed Evelyn Callahan receive a cash payment of $500 from an agent of Montgomery Cattle and put her mark to a deed of sale. That is a lie, Evie said. She said it directly to him, not to Montgomery, not to Pike, to Elian Marsh, and she said it clearly, without cruelty, but without softening it either. You are lying. You know you are, and you will know it for the rest of your life, regardless of how this ends. Elian Marsh said nothing, but something cracked across his face. Not enough to show anyone else. Enough that Evie saw it. Furthermore, she said, turning back to Montgomery, on the 14th of May, I was in Harlan at Hewitt's Mercantile purchasing wire and lamp oil. I have the receipt. The date and time are on it, along with the storekeeper's signature. I also have the livery record from the same morning. I can produce both within the hour. It will be very difficult to testify that I signed a deed in my yard on a morning I spent 17 miles away. Something passed briefly across Montgomery's face. Not surprise, exactly. The adjustment of a man who had anticipated resistance but was recalibrating the degree of it. He tucked the document back in his jacket. The filing stands as recorded, he said. The court will determine the competing claims in time. Meanwhile, Sheriff Pike has the authority to begin eviction proceedings. Pike moved his horse 2 paces forward. He looked past Evie at the house with the assessing expression of someone already planning what gets cleared out first. Mrs. Callahan, I'd ask you to gather your essentials and your child and come along peaceably. I'd ask you to produce a court order signed by an actual sitting judge. Pike's expression tightened. We'll have one before the week's out. Then I'll be here when you bring it. She kept her voice flat and even. I'll be here with my receipts, my original deed, and legal counsel. You don't have counsel, Montgomery said. I will. A long pause arranged itself in the yard, hot and quiet and waiting. Then Montgomery gave a short nod to the closer rider. The man climbed down, tall, broad, flat-faced. He crossed the yard with the efficient pace of someone who had removed people from places before and expected this to be no different. His arm came up. The barn door swung open. Cale came around the corner with a mallet in one hand and a fencing staple in the other. He stopped. He looked at the rider, at Evie, at the assembled procession in the yard. The rider reached for Evie's arm. Cale's right hand dropped. The Colt came up. The shot cracked out across the basin, so sharp it split the silence like a ruled line. The rider's gun was out of his holster and spinning through the air before anyone had processed the sound. And the man was stumbling back with his right hand pressed against his chest, looking from his empty palm to the weapon in the dirt. 8 feet away, with the expression of a man who cannot account for a fact he knows just happened. No one moved. Cale stood with the Colt still up, elbow barely bent. His breathing was even. He still has the full use of that hand, he said. I'd like to keep it that way. He lowered the gun, did not holster it. Montgomery looked at Cale with real focus for the first time, not anger. Calculation, a revision in progress. You're the ghost of Sweetwater, he said. Cale said nothing. You walked away from that name. I walked away from the work that earned it, Cale said. I didn't walk away from the skill. The gray stallion sidestepped under tension in the reins. Pike had his hand near his own gun and hadn't touched it and wasn't going to. Some calculations weren't difficult. Montgomery looked at Evie. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was the same thing, just without the coating. "I will have this land," he said. "Every instrument available to me, legal, financial, and otherwise." "Legal will fail," she said, "and otherwise will cost you more than the land is worth." He turned his horse, rode out at the same measured pace he'd arrived, his riders closing around the carriage. Elian Marsh climbed back into it and didn't look at Evie, but in the second before the curtain fell across the window, she saw his face through the glass, and what was in it was not the expression of a man who had won anything. Pike was last. He held his position a moment, looking at Evie, then at Cale, then he turned and rode out. The yard was still. Cale holstered the Colt. He looked at Evie. "You all right?" "Yes." She straightened her collar. "I've had a clearer picture of my legal position before." "But yes." He nodded once, picked up the mallet, went back to the fence. That evening, after supper, Evie spread the valley map across the table and set her pencil to a point several inches east of Blackwood Basin. "Ridgecrest," she said. Cale sat across from her. "What about it?" "Army Supply Depot. Being built now. Jensen the farrier told me 2 weeks ago. He did the early ironwork. They expect to be operational by winter." Cale looked at the map. Something in his face sharpened, the slow shift of a man connecting pieces he's been holding separately. "What kind of supply operation?" he said. "Beef, large scale. The kind that requires consistent supply through every season." She looked at him. "What does an operation like that need more than anything else in a drought year?" Cale was quiet for a moment. "Then reliable water." She tapped the spring. "Year-round water," she said. "Every other source in the valley has been drawing down for 3 months. Half the ranches can't guarantee supply through August. Mine can, because this spring doesn't come from surface water." She set the pencil down. "A $50,000 exclusive beef contract with the Army. Whoever controls reliable water controls that contract." Cale sat back. He was looking at the map, but thinking past it. "For a man like Montgomery, that's not just money. No, it's a territorial monopoly for the next decade, maybe longer." She began rolling the map. The forged deed, the bought attestimony, the sheriff with his badge for hire. All of it. This was never about $100 or $500. It was always about this. And he's not going to stop. No. She put the map away and looked at him, which means neither can I. She stored the ledger and the receipts in the tin box and latched it. From down the hall, the house was quiet in a way that wasn't quite sleep. Cale got up from the table and walked to the hallway. He stopped at the door to Eli's room. The boy was sitting up in bed. He had the look of someone who had been listening through a thin wall and understood more than any adult had accounted for. Cale stepped inside and crouched down until they were eye level. The lamp threw a long stripe of yellow across the floor between them. "You saw what happened in the yard today," he said. Eli was still. His eyes were wide and steady. "A man was going to grab your mother. I stopped him." He looked at the boy squarely. "But I want you to understand something about that, about guns, about what strength actually is." He held Eli's eyes. "The best gunfighter isn't the man who kills the most," Cale said, "but the man who knows when not to pull the trigger to keep his own humanity." The word settled in the lamplit room. Humanity. Eli looked at the hallway where the Colt hung on the peg. Then back at Cale. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and placed one small hand on Cale's forearm. Just that. A child's hand on a grown man's arm. Cale went very still. His jaw worked once. "Go to sleep," he said, quietly. He walked back down the hall. Evie was still at the table. She had heard every word. She didn't look up when he sat down. After a moment, she heard him pour his coffee, and they stayed there together in the lamplit kitchen until the stove burned low. Outside, the spring moved through the dark, cold and constant, $50,000 worth of truth, flowing clean through stone, while the rest of the valley dried to nothing. The draw had reopened the wound. She saw it at breakfast, the careful way he held his right arm against his body. the fractional hesitation before he reached for his coffee cup. He wasn't favoring it enough to be obvious about it. He was favoring it in the way someone did when they decided to manage a problem privately and preferred not to be noticed managing it. She waited until Eli had gone out to feed the chickens. "Sit down," she said. Cale looked up. "Your shoulder yesterday cost you something. I need to look at it." "It's holding. That's not the same as fine. Sit down." Something passed through his expression, not quite resistance. The particular reluctance of a man who had been self-sufficient by necessity for so long that accepting help from another person required a moment of deliberate decision. He set his coffee cup down and sat. She pulled the medicine box from the shelf and set it on the table beside him. She unwound the bandage from his shoulder, careful at the edges where the cloth had adhered. Overnight, he was still for it. The stillness of endurance rather than comfort. He did not make a sound. The wound from the week before had pulled at the lower edge. Not badly, but the tissue was angry, red at the border where it had been stressed. She cleaned it with a boiled cloth, steady and methodical, pressing with enough firmness to be effective and no more than that. Then she reached for the dried yarrow and the pine resin in the tin, began mixing the poultice in the small bowl. That was when she saw them, the old scars. There were 5 she could count from where she stood. 3 on his back, irregular and pale, exit wounds, the marks of bullets that had passed all the way through. 1 on his left side, just below the ribs, long and straight, a knife scar healed clean. 1 above the current wound on his shoulder, older, slightly puckered, where it had been treated badly or not treated at all. She kept her hands moving. She did not pause over them, did not remark on them, did not let her expression shift into the particular look that people got when confronting evidence of violence, that complicated mixture of pity and discomfort, and the urge to say something about it. These were part of a man's body. He was sitting still and letting her help him. That was what the moment required. She pressed the poultice to the wound and began wrapping the fresh bandage. She leaned across him to take the end of the roll from the table. His left hand came up. His fingers closed gently around her wrist. Not tight, nothing urgent about it. The kind of contact that stops something not to prevent it, but to hold it. She went still. He went still. His thumb was against the inside of her wrist. Her pulse was there, going faster than she would have liked, and he could certainly feel that. The morning light from the kitchen window came in at a low angle and fell across his face. She was close enough to see the exact gray of his eyes, the blue underneath them, like water with depth to it. Neither of them moved. 1 second, 2. Then his hand opened. He released her wrist. He turned his face away, his jaw set like something being latched. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be." She reached the end of the bandage roll and finished wrapping. Her hands did not shake. It was nothing. No. His voice was low and certain. It wasn't. She tied the bandage off, stepped back. "Then we don't need to manufacture it into something it isn't," she said. She kept her tone even. Matter of fact, 2 people in a kitchen in the morning light. He was looking at his hands in his lap, his right hand, the one that had drawn yesterday. "You're a good woman," he said. "You've mentioned something along those lines before. I mean it as more than a compliment." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a good man, Evie. I've been a long way from one for a long time. The things that put these scars in other men didn't happen by accident. I was there. I did the work. And a few weeks of fence posts doesn't change what that history is." She looked at him. He still wasn't looking up. "The man who did that work," she said slowly, "is he the same man who yesterday shot a weapon out of a man's hand rather than put a bullet through him?" Cale didn't answer. "Is he the same man who crouched down to my son's level last night in the dark and explained to him why not killing is a greater strength than killing?" His jaw tightened. "People aren't only what they've done," she said. "They're also what they've chosen to stop doing and what they've decided to become instead. That's not a small thing. That takes more out of a person than the original wrong ever did." She picked up the medicine box and put it back on its shelf. I'm not asking anything of you. I'm not in the business of rescuing men who don't want to be rescued. But I will not sit here and listen to you. Tell me that what I see in front of me isn't real, because I am a school teacher, and I am very good at knowing when I'm being told something false. He looked up at her then. She was already turning toward the stove to start the morning dishes. After a moment, she heard him get up and take his hat from the hook by the door. Come in, around 4, she said. I want to show you something before supper. He came in at 4 with dust on his collar and the careful posture of a man whose shoulder was making itself quietly known. Eli came in 3 steps behind him and set a flat white stone on the kitchen windowsill beside the boot-shaped one, considered the arrangement with great seriousness, and sat down. KL sat at the table. Evie came out of the bedroom with a flat tin box under her arm. She set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather ledger with a brass clasp worn smooth from years of regular opening. She set it in front of Cale. He picked it up, opened it. The entries were small and precise. A trained hand, clean columns of dates and figures. But beside the standard accounting entries, running down the outer margin and appearing between certain lines, were consistent, repeating, clearly, systematic. Letters that weren't standard letters. A notation that meant something specific to whoever had built the code and referenced something outside the page. What is this? He said. A cross-referenced ledger. She sat down across from him and folded her hands. Every entry corresponds to a physical receipt stored in this box. The symbols in the margin tell me which drawer, which month, which category, date, amount, purpose, and the physical evidence for each. I built it from scratch on the ride west. He turned a page, then another. His eyes moved over the entries. You said you were a teacher, he said. 6 years, Hartford, Connecticut, elementary grades. She looked at the ledger. The school board I worked for was loose with their supply records, loose in the specific way of people who know no one is going to check them. I developed the notation system to make my own classroom records irrefutable, in case I ever needed to demonstrate where the chalk and the copybooks and the lamp oil had actually gone. She paused. When my husband and I came west and started the ranch, I applied the same system to the operation. Every head of cattle purchased or sold or lost, every water haul, every bag of feed, every repair. The drought record from the beginning of this year. What was grazed and when, what failed and why. He closed the ledger and looked at her. 3 years of records, he said. 3 years and 4 months continuous, without a gap. He sat back, and May 14th is in here. She took the ledger from him and turned the pages with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where every entry lived. She opened it flat on the table and turned it so he could read the entry without straining. May 14. Date. Hewitt's Mercantile. Harlan. Wire. Lamp oil. Amount. And in the margin, a symbol with a secondary notation. She tapped it. Cross-reference to the receipt and the livery record. I stabled my horse for 2 hours while I was in town. Both are in the box. Cale read the entry and the symbol. Then he looked at her. Ellie and Marsh testified that you signed a deed in your yard on the 14th, he said. He testified to something that my own ledger, independently built over 3 years without any awareness this would ever matter, contradicts directly. She closed the book. This isn't a record I made last week to defend myself. This is a record I've kept since before Montgomery had any interest in this land. That's the thing about documentation. It's most useful when no one knows yet that it will be needed. You need to file it, he said, formally, as counter-evidence against the deed. I know. She latched the tin box shut. I'm going tomorrow morning. I want you with me. They rode into Harlan under a white sky that had threatened heat since dawn, and finally delivered it by the time they reached the edge of town. The main street had the hollow look of a place, contracting around a diminishing economy. Fewer cattle through the yards. Half the storefronts shuttered. What remained was holding on. The Territorial Land Registry and the Sheriff's Office occupied the same building at the end of the block, 2 rooms behind a door with territorial seals nailed to the frame. Evie walked in first. Pike was behind the desk, writing something or appearing to write something. He looked up when they came in, and she saw, in the half-second before his expression arranged itself, that he had been expecting them. Mrs. Callahan, Sheriff. She set the tin box on his desk and opened it. She placed the ledger on the surface between them. I'm here to file documentary counter-evidence against the deed of sale filed by Montgomery Cattle and Land. This ledger contains 3 years of consecutive ranch records, cross-referenced to physical receipts, including a dated entry for May 14th, placing me 17 miles from this property during the hours, Elian Marsh claims, I was present for a signing. Pike looked at the ledger. He did not pick it up. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided about before it arrived. Mrs. Callahan, he said. His voice had its official coating on it, measured, not unkind in its surface. I appreciate the effort you've put into this. I do. He looked up at her. But this office is not positioned to accept a personal ledger as documentary evidence in a territorial land dispute. On what specific basis? He laced his hands on the desk. Territorial statute governing property record disputes requires that financial documentation be countersigned by a male head of household or an authorized male representative, such as a licensed attorney or a bank officer. This ledger, maintained solely under your own authority, does not meet that evidentiary threshold. Evie looked at him for a long moment. Her hands rested flat on the desk on either side of the tin box. Let me make sure I'm understanding you, she said. A precise 3-year record of every financial transaction on this property, cross-referenced to physical receipts, consistent, unbroken, and directly contradicting sworn testimony filed against me, is inadmissible because no man co-signed it. Pike's expression said that was approximately correct. The law doesn't honor a widow's bookkeeping without a man's signature beside it, he said. The sentence sat in the room like something solid. Behind her, Cale's crossed arms tightened slightly. She didn't look at him. She took a slow breath. In, out. Truth doesn't carry a gender, Sheriff, she said. Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that had pressure in it, and a human being's dignity doesn't depend on whether a man stands beside her, on paper. Pike's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes. He couldn't quite suppress it. He had been doing this work long enough to know when he just heard something that would not stay in this room. Be that as it may, the statutory requirement. Be that as it is, she said. You have refused to accept legitimate counter-evidence in a land fraud case. I am noting the date, the time, and your stated reason. That note will be presented to the territorial judge alongside this ledger when this reaches a proper court of law. She closed the tin box and latched it. And I want you to understand something, Sheriff. I spent 6 years teaching children to read and write, and to understand the law and why it exists. I know exactly what your statute says, and I know exactly what it was designed to protect. And it was not designed to protect men like Thaddeus Montgomery from women with accurate receipts. She picked up the tin box, looked at him one final time. Good morning, she said. She walked out. Cale held the door and let it swing shut behind them. They stood on the boardwalk. The heat was full and direct now, coming off the packed earth of the street in slow waves. Evie was looking at the road, composed, entirely composed. Her jaw was set, and her hands were tight on the box, but her face held nothing except clarity. He's going to be on a witness stand, Cale said. I know, and what he just said is on the record now. You told him you were noting it. A judge is going to hear that a county sheriff refused a widow's 3-year ledger because no man had signed it. She looked at Cale in a room full of people. I want that speech heard in open court. I want a judge to have to decide whether the law means what Pike said it means, or whether it means something better than that. Cale was quiet for a moment. You came in here knowing he'd refuse it, he said. She didn't answer. But something in her eyes said yes. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he walked down the boardwalk steps toward the horses. They rode home under the full weight of the afternoon. By the time they reached the basin, the sky had gone a pale, bleached blue that meant the heat would hold through evening. Evie stopped her horse at the spring on the way to the barn. She sat there a moment, not long, just enough to hear the water. She thought about what Pike had said. She thought about every version of that same sentence she had heard in her life, in different settings, wearing different words. The school board in Hartford, who had required her husband's signature on her employment contract renewal. The bank in this very town that had initially refused to open an account in her name alone after her husband died. The deed to this property, which she had been required to have witnessed by two men whose names she had barely known, though her own name was the one on the line. Always some version of that same arithmetic. Your record is real, but requires a man's authority to be real enough. She had refused to accept that arithmetic then. She refused it now. Cale came up beside her on his horse. He looked at the spring, then at her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. How long people have been telling me my word isn't enough on its own. She watched the water come through the limestone, and how tired I am of proving them wrong one receipt at a time, and how I'm going to keep doing it anyway. He was quiet. Then, after a moment, for what it's worth, she looked at him. "Your word," he said carefully, "has been enough. Since the first morning." She held his gaze for a second. Something moved through her chest. Not quite pain, and not quite warmth. Something that lived between the two. "Thank you," she said. She turned her horse toward the barn. Behind her, the spring came cold and clear through the rock, clean as a fact, belonging to the earth that made it, and to the woman with the ledger who had documented every drop. The news came from Jensen, the farrier. He rode up fast on a Thursday morning, his horse lathered, and his face carrying the look of a man who has heard something bad, and now has to be the one to pass it along. He didn't soften it. Jensen wasn't built for softening things. Montgomery had gone to the territorial court, filed papers classifying Evie as a squatter on disputed land, applied for a bounty-backed forced eviction under a clause written for claim jumpers and abandoned properties. A clause that had never once in its history been pointed at a widow with 3 years of documented ownership and a working spring and a child. $1,000, posted at the Comstock Hotel board, the trading post, and the land office window. 40 men assembled in Harlan, not Montgomery's usual ranch hands. These had been brought in from outside the territory on purpose, because men with no local connection had no local hesitation. Bounty hunters, hired mercenaries, men who moved from flashpoint to flashpoint across the West, arriving wherever someone with money needed something done that the law wasn't technically permitted to do itself. 2 days they've been in town, Jensen said from his horse. He hadn't dismounted. Montgomery's putting them up at the hotel, feeding them. They're waiting for his word. He gripped the reins until his knuckles whitened. Day after tomorrow at the outside. Men like that, once they're drinking and paid, they don't sit patient long. Evie thanked him. He rode out without looking back. She understood that. A man in Jensen's position had a business to run and a family to feed. Knowing was already a risk. Telling her was more. She stood in the yard. The sun pressed down hard and steady, and didn't offer any kind of opinion about what it was pressing down on. Then she went inside. She didn't sit. She opened the tin box and looked at the ledger and the receipts and the map. She stepped back from it mentally, the way she had learned to step back from a difficult problem and look at its actual shape before deciding what to do with it. 80 acres, a house, a barn, a Sweetwater spring that ran clean when every other source in the valley had failed. 3 years of work in every fence post and every entry in the coded ledger. A child who was watching her every move to learn what the world was and what you did when it came at you. She closed the box, put on her hat, went out to start organizing. Cale found her 2 hours later at the workbench behind the barn. She'd laid the full ammunition stock out by type, counted everything, made 2 columns in her notebook, and was sketching defensive positions across the back of the property map. He stopped and read the paper over her shoulder. Jensen talked, she said. 40 men, day after tomorrow. He stood with that for a moment, taking it in completely before moving. You should take Eli and go, he said. I can slow them down. 3 days head start, Denver, Salt Lake. Somewhere the warrant doesn't reach. No. No. She turned from the bench and looked at him. If I run today, my son learns that justice bows to brute force. She held his eyes when she said it. She meant each word individually. He watches everything, she said. Every choice I make, he is filing away as information about how this world works and what a person does when it comes at them hard. If I pack him up and run from a paid bully with a forged deed, that is the lesson he carries for the rest of his life. That power wins. That law is only real for the people who can buy it. She turned back to the bench. He is not going to learn that. Not from me. A long silence arranged itself between them in the afternoon heat. Then we need a plan, Cale said. She handed him the ammunition list. I started one. They spent the afternoon on it. He walked the full property perimeter, testing sight lines from each fence post, checking elevation at the rock shelf above the spring, measuring the barn's angle against the eastern approach. He paced distances and came back with numbers. She cross-referenced on the map. 2 people on known ground against 40 on ground they didn't know. The math still didn't fully resolve in their favor, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But there was a version of this where the cost of taking this ranch, in a very short time, climbed above what the Army contract was worth to a man already invested in bribes and bounties and hired men. That was the plan they built toward. After supper, Cale walked down the hall and stopped at Eli's door. The boy was sitting up in bed, turning the flat white stone between his palms. The lamp was burning low on the shelf. He looked at Cale without alarm, just watching, steady and clear, the way he watched everything. Cale sat down on the floor with his back against the far wall. He didn't say anything. He was just there, present. Eli looked at him for a while. Then he set the stone on the windowsill, lay down, and pulled the blanket to his chin. His eyes found Cale in the corner, held there. Cale stayed until the boy's breathing slowed and evened out. Then he came back to the kitchen. She had the rifle broken down and was running the cleaning rod through the barrel. Both revolvers sat on the oilcloth beside it. A bowl of water and clean cloth strips, boiled from a spare sheet, were at the end of the table, rolled tight and stacked. Medical supplies. For afterward, whatever afterward turned out to be. He sat down across from her and picked up the cartridge box, started checking loads one at a time. Weight, seal, the faint indent of a properly set primer. He pulled the bad ones and set them aside. They worked for close to 3 hours in the lamplit kitchen, not talking much. When they talked, it was about positions and signals and angles. Practical language for a situation that required clarity above everything else. Cale, she said, somewhere around the 2nd hour, not looking up from the rifle. You don't have to stay. I know. I mean that plainly. This isn't your land. The warrant isn't on you. Whatever you feel you owe me for wages and a hot meal, it doesn't add up to 40 armed men. He kept checking cartridges, one at a time, steady. No, he said, it doesn't. She finally looked up. But I'm staying. He held around to the lamp and checked it and set it with the others. It's settled. Don't bring it up again. She looked at him for a long moment, at the lamplit planes of his face, at his hands moving through the ammunition with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a decision and was done with the making of it. There was no performance in him. He wasn't dramatic about it, and he wasn't seeking anything from her in return for it. He was simply present and certain and not going anywhere. All right, she said. She went back to the rifle. They finished close to midnight and put everything in order. Guns on their pegs, supplies on the shelf by the door, map folded with the defensive positions marked on the outside for quick reference in low light. She turned down the lamp. In the darkened kitchen doorway, they stood briefly, a foot apart. The house quiet around them. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. She went down the hall. He went out to the barn. Outside, the valley held its heat, even in the dark. The stars were hard and dry overhead. Due northwest, over the flat reaches past the ridge, a wall of cloud and grit was moving slowly, building over 3 days now, not yet arrived. In the morning, there would be 40 riders on the east road and $1,000 on her head. Tonight, there was the prepared ammunition on the shelf, and the rolled bandages and the plan on the map, and 2 people who had made their decision and gone to sleep certain of it. They came at mid-morning, not at dawn the way armies came. Mid-morning, when the sun was fully up, and brutal, and anyone watching from the house had to look directly into the glare to count them. That was intentional. Men who did this kind of work for money knew the value of the light being wrong for the person they were coming for. Evie heard the rumble from the east road first. The collective weight of organized horses on hard-packed ground, a low drumming felt as much as heard. She was already on the porch, had been since before the sun cleared the ridge. She had drunk her coffee and eaten, and when Eli came out and sat beside her on the bench, she kept her hand on his back and talked about small things. The chickens, the south fence, whether it might rain before August. Then she heard them. "Go inside," she said. He looked at the road. "Inside. Back room. Under the bed if you hear shooting. Don't come out until I come for you." He looked at her face. He got up without crying or arguing, took his flat white stone from the step, and went inside. The door closed quietly behind him. She stood at the porch rail and watched them come, 40 riders. They spread wide across the approach, flanking both sides of the road, pushing out to the fence lines on either edge of the property. At the front, Montgomery on the iron gray stallion. 2 senior men directly behind him. The remaining 37 filling the formation in a practiced easy spread. They had done this before, in different places, with different names on the deed, and the efficiency of their arrival showed it. They came through the gate and fanned into a horseshoe across the yard. The arms of it extended to both sides of the barn. The front of the formation sat 40 feet from the porch. Montgomery looked at her. She looked at him. He let the silence press down. 40 horses breathed and shifted in the heat. A dry wind came through the yard, in slow, carrying grit from the northwest. It had been coming and going for 2 days, now building. "Mrs. Callahan." He said her name with the particular finality of a man at the end of his patience. She kept her hands on the rail, said nothing. He raised his hand. "Seize that woman and throw her off my land." 3 men dismounted from the front of the line, big, heavy, measured in their pace. They crossed the yard without hurrying, spread 6 feet apart, watching her hands and the windows and the barn door simultaneously, with the distributed attention of men who had made this walk before and expected it to resolve the same way it always did. 10 feet. 8. A spur clinked against the barn floor. One metallic sound, deliberate and clear in the heat. Then another. The barn door swung open flat against the wall, and Cale stepped out into the full noonlight and stopped. He stood with both hands loose at his sides. He was holding nothing. His eyes crossed the 3 men in the yard and then moved once slowly across the 37 mounted behind them, taking in the whole formation. 4 seconds. Then he went still. The 3 men stopped. Something moved through the mounted line behind them. Not noise, the opposite of noise. 37 riders went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with orders or discipline. It came from below decision, from the part of a man's brain that registers a particular kind of presence and sends a signal that is older than language. 2 riders near the center moved their horses back 1 step each. They hadn't been told, they did it, and held. The name passed through the line the way water finds level. Ghost of Sweetwater. Some of them knew it only from stories, and had discounted the stories the way you discounted anything you hadn't seen yourself. Some of them had met men who had tested what the stories described, And those men had come home different or hadn't come home. The ones who knew most went most still. "Take one more step," Cale said. He said it at regular volume. No staging to it, no performance of threat. He said it the way you state a temperature or a distance. Simply what was true. The three men in the yard stood exactly where they were. Then, from the back of the formation, a rider pulled his rifle. Young, new. The kind of man who reads stillness wrong and decides it's his opening. He brought the rifle up and fired. The shot hit dirt, 4 feet left of Cale. Everything moved at once. Cale went right, already in motion before the sound registered, and the Colt was out, and he was behind the barn corner post, and firing before the second shot was chambered. The rifle spun from the young rider's hands. His horse spooked sideways, and the three men nearest him spent 4 seconds managing horses instead of weapons. He came off the post moving, left and wide, sweeping around the yard's edge. The three men who'd dismounted separated, and he went for the nearest one first. Close in, elbow height. The shot drove the gun from the man's grip by shock before the man understood what had happened. The second one leveled his pistol, and Cale was already lateral, inside the angle, deflecting the barrel with his forearm and stepping past. The third went for Cale's shooting hand. Cale let the momentum carry him through a turn, came back inside the man's reach, and put an elbow into his shoulder. The man sat down in the dirt. 3 men, 4 seconds, all of them intact, all of them disarmed. He kept moving, barn corner to fence post, to open yard in a pattern that gave no one a stable target. The Colt was firing into the formation in a sweep that targeted weapons, reins, and the ground in front of horses. He was not trying to kill anyone. He was trying to make the cost of being in this yard immediate and personal and ongoing for every man still holding a weapon. From the porch, Evie worked the rifle, warning shots into the ground in front of any rider who pressed toward the house. Her aim was precise and deliberate. She shot to stop movement, not to wound. 3 times she interrupted a flanking push that would have circled past Cale's position. The formation was losing its shape. Riders pulled back from the front as man after man came away from an engagement with Cale, minus his weapon and carrying a specific expression, the look of someone who had expected one thing and encountered something categorically different. Montgomery moved. He pulled his horse back from the front quietly and circled wide around the east side of the barn, staying behind the structure and out of sight from both the porch and the yard. He dismounted at the rear wall, left the horse, moved on foot along the south face of the barn, where the building itself cut every sight line. He came around the corner, 8 feet behind Cale. Cale was turned toward the front of the yard, tracking a rider, pushing through the smoke. He did not hear Montgomery over the noise of 40 horses and rifles and the rising wind from the northwest. Montgomery shot him through the left shoulder from 8 feet. The bullet passed through and drove Cale forward. He hit the fence post with his right hand and caught himself and held. He did not go down. He was still upright, still operational, just barely. He turned. Montgomery had the gun level and up for the second shot. The wind arrived. 3 days of building over the dry flats northwest of the valley, and it arrived with nothing gradual about it. The first wall hit Blackwood Basin like a physical blow, a solid mass of hot grit and brown air moving at speed. Visibility went to 10 feet, then 5. The sound of it was total, a roaring directionless pressure that swallowed voices and gunfire and horse noise into one undifferentiated wall. Montgomery fired into it and hit post. Cale looked left, through the moving grit, through the brown obliteration of it. The oil lamp inside the barn door was still burning, a faint yellow smear in the dark wall of the storm. He had noticed it that morning when they'd worked by its light before the sun came up. He had thought about it then without knowing why, and he knew why now. He raised the Colt and shot the lamp. The oil hit the dry door frame and climbed immediately. The smoke it made was black and total, billowing out into the storm in thick rolling masses, mixing with the grit until the yard was completely, absolutely blind. No visibility at 5 feet. No visibility at 2. Evie was already at the back of the barn. She'd heard the second shot and the lamp go, and she moved without waiting for anything else. Eli was in her hand, the boy's eyes pressed shut against the grit, both his hands holding hers, completely silent and completely trusting. She came around the back corner of the barn, through the driving dark, and found Cale at the fence post with his right hand flat against the wood and his left arm held rigid against his body. She got under his right arm. He shifted weight onto her without discussion, and they moved. The wagon was behind the barn, already hitched. She had done this before sunrise, quietly, while the house was still dark. Not because she had planned to run, because she had wanted the exit available if the plan required it. She got Cale onto the seat. Eli climbed up and placed himself between them and gripped the bench rail with both hands. She took the reins, brought the horses around the barn's back edge and into the canyon mouth, navigating by memory because there was no visibility left in the world for anything else. She knew the canyon. She knew every bend and every drop and every overhang for 30 miles. She drove it at a full run by knowledge alone, and the horses trusted her weight on the reins and ran. Behind them, 40 men were blind in smoke and grit and wind, and had no idea which direction led to a canyon entrance they had never seen. On ground they had arrived at 2 days ago. The canyon walls came up on both sides, close and gray through the storm haze. The sound of the wind became remote above the rock. She let the horses come back to a walk. Her arms were shaking from the reins, and she let them shake and kept her hands on the leather and kept going. Cale was still upright beside her, pale under the coating of dust and grit on everything, his left arm against his body, his right hand on the rail. Cale. "Here?" he said. Eli turned and looked at him, clear-eyed in his dust-covered face. He reached across and placed his hand over Cale's on the rail, small and deliberate and certain. "Look down at that hand." He looked at Evie. She faced forward and drove deeper into the canyon, east and further toward the mountains. The dark ahead was complete, and the walls were close on both sides. The land was behind them, and the spring was behind them, and 40 men with $1,000 bounty were behind them, blind in the storm. The tin box was under the seat. The ledger was in the tin box. Every receipt and every notation, and 3 years of unbroken truth latched tight and coming with them. She drove on. The cabin was 3 miles into the mountains, on a trail most people had no reason to know about. A hunter had built it years back. No one in the valley remembered his name anymore. What remained was 4 solid walls, a stone hearth, a door that needed forcing, and a shutter hanging by one hinge on the east window. Sufficient. That was all she needed it to be. She got Cale inside before the storm's worst wall hit. He could walk, she kept one hand at his right arm and let him carry what he could. And when the pine needle slope went uncertain under his feet, she took more weight without commentary. Eli held the horse by the bridle at the overhang along the cabin's east wall and stood in the driving grit, with his chin set and his eyes narrow and waited. She got the fire started, got the lantern lit. Then she got his shirt off and found out the bullet had not gone through. She had suspected this. The entry wound told the story. The shot had come from 8 feet at a downward angle and had gone into the back of the left shoulder and had stopped somewhere inside, and whatever it had touched on the way in had given Cale that careful stillness for the past 3 hours that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with a man managing serious pain on the move. He was already running fever. She could feel the heat rising from him from 2 feet away. She had brought the medicine box. She had packed it before sunrise that morning, along with everything else, not knowing exactly what the day would require, packing anyway because preparation is not pessimism, it is understanding that emergencies do not announce themselves far enough ahead to shop for supplies. She boiled water in the camp kettle, cleaned her hands until they were red and raw, found the bullet with 2 fingers and a clean knife blade by lantern light. She took her time with it, rushing, This was the one thing she could not afford. She got it out. Cale pressed his right hand flat against the floor planks and made no sound through all of it. In the moments when the fever gave him back to himself, he held and was still. When it took him back under, she kept working. "Still here," he said once, from somewhere below full waking. "Yes," she said. "Stay that way." She packed and bound the wound and held pressure until the bleeding slowed. Then she tended the fire and watched him and didn't sleep. The first night was the worst of it. The fever climbed steadily through midnight, and she put cold cloths on his forehead and on the inside of his wrists and talked to him when he surfaced. Short sentences, practical ones, where they were, that Eli was asleep in the corner on the bedroll. The bleeding had stopped. She gave him facts to orient to, because a man pulled back from fever needs a handhold in the real world, or he drifts back under. The second day she went into the pines, mountain terrain. She had cataloged what grew at this elevation the previous winter during a sick cow emergency, and that knowledge was available to her now the way all systematically gathered knowledge eventually becomes available. Wild yarrow on the open slope east of the cabin, osha root near the stream below, pine resin, fresh from the north-facing trees, running thick. She dried what needed drying over flat stones at the fire, ground the rest. Her hands were raw by midday. The yarrow was dry and resistant, and she worked it against the grinding stone until it was powder, then mixed it with resin and boiled water into a paste and applied it to the wound with clean cloth. She changed the dressing 3 times a day and observed the wound margin each time for the specific signs that would tell her whether they were winning or losing. They were winning slowly. Eli was steady through all of it. He carried water without prompting. He kept the fire fed in long, patient intervals. When Cale was restless in the night, the boy would come and sit close and be still. Whatever that stillness communicated, it seemed to reach through the fever. On the morning of the third day, she was at the fire before the light had fully come through the trees. She was grinding the last of the yarrow for the morning dressing. Her knuckles had cracked at both hands, and the bruising across her palms had deepened overnight. Her back ached from the chair, and her eyes burned from the hours she had not slept. She heard his breathing change. She turned from the fire. He was looking at the ceiling beams. Then his head turned toward her, slowly, with the measured deliberateness of a man returning from a long distance. She crossed the cabin and crouched beside him and looked at his face. Color was returning. The fever's vacancy was gone from his eyes. He was present, actually present. He looked at her face. He looked at it for a long moment, taking in what was there. The pallor, the sleeplessness, the state of her hair entirely out of its pins for the first time he had ever seen it. Then he looked down at her hands, both of them, the bruising at the palms, the cracked knuckles, the raw skin where the yarrow dust had worked into every small cut over 2 days of grinding. His jaw moved. A long breath went out of him. "Evie," he said, rough from 3 days, without enough water. "Don't sit up yet." She reached for the water tin and brought it to him, and he drank, and his right hand came up and wrapped around hers on the tin, not to steady it, something else. She put the tin down. He was still looking at her hands. He took the left one and turned it over in his palm and looked at the bruising there. He pressed his thumb once across her knuckles, slow and careful, pressing nothing hard. Then he looked at her face. All of it was there in his eyes. Everything he had been telling himself for weeks about what he was worth, about what he'd surrendered the right to, about blood-soaked history, and the distance a man was supposed to keep from anything still whole and worth keeping. He had constructed that argument carefully and lived inside it, and it had served him until 3 days in a mountain cabin had taken it entirely apart. He reached up with his right hand, his palm against her jaw. He brought her forward. The kiss was deep and certain, not tentative, not cautious. His hand was steady against her face, and she was leaning into him, and 2 years of widowhood and a summer of drought and 40 armed men and 3 days of grinding you woe by lamplight were all present in it. Gratitude was in it. Real desire was in it. Something fiercer than either one underneath. Two people who had been alone in the hard country and had stopped expecting to find something worth the risk, and had found it anyway, and had been circling it at a careful remove for weeks. When they broke, she stayed close, his forehead against hers. She could hear him breathing. "Evie," he said again. "I know," she said. She pulled back enough to look at him. The color was better. His eyes were clear. "Eli's outside," she said. "He's been keeping the horse company." From beyond the door came the low sound of the boy talking to the animal about something. Neither of them could make out the words. Just a child's voice in the morning light, talking to a horse in the pines, ordinary as the trees themselves. Cale closed his eyes. His right hand held hers. "Thank you," he said. "Eat something," she said. "Then sleep. Real sleep this time." She got up and went back to the fire and started heating the morning broth. And neither of them said anything further that needed to be said, because it had already been said in the space between words. She had reached into the worst of him and brought him back, not because she needed anything in return, but because she was the kind of woman who showed up completely when someone needed saving. That was who she was. That was enough. By the fourth morning, Cale was on his feet, not at full strength. He moved with the careful economy of a man who understood precisely what his body's current limits were and was not going to exceed them. He ate. He sat in the doorway in the afternoons and watched the canyon below. He said little, but he was upright and functional, and the wound margin, when she changed the dressing, was clean. He was going to be all right. On the fifth morning, she told him she was going to Elian Marsh's farm, alone. He looked at her across the fire. "He won't talk if you're there," she said. "Men in Elian's position don't talk when there's a gun at the table. He'll talk to me." "How do you know that?" "I saw his face through the carriage window when they left my yard the second time." She poured his coffee and set it in front of him. "A man who believed in what he was doing doesn't look like that. He is not a dishonest man. He is a frightened one who was put in an impossible position and made the wrong choice and has been paying for it ever since. Those are different things, and they require a different approach." Cale sat with that. After a moment, "You're going to forgive him." She looked at him. "I'm going to give him a reason to be brave. That's what he actually needs. Not another threat. Montgomery already owns his fear. More threats just keep him paralyzed. A man who has stopped moving because he's afraid doesn't need more to fear. He needs something to move toward." Cale nodded slowly. "Back before dark." "Before dark," she said. She rode down through the southern draw the long way around, avoiding the main road. She left her horse in the tree line below the farm and crossed the last quarter-mile on foot. She had no intention of being visible in the valley until she knew what Elian Marsh had to tell her. The farm showed her things before she reached the door. The fence line unmaintained, the garden given over to drought and inattention both, gates left unlatched. This was a place where a man had stopped making decisions about the future, and that showed clearly in everything left undone. She knocked. Agnes Marsh came to the door. She looked at Evie with an expression that was exhaustion and relief and dread, all arriving at once. She stepped back without speaking and let Evie inside. Elian was at the kitchen table with a coffee cup held in both hands and his eyes on it. When she came through the door, he looked up and set the cup down, and the table shook. She sat across from him. Agnes moved to the far wall and stood with her arms folded. "Not leaving. Staying." "I heard what happened," Elian said. His voice had been worn down to something flat. "The gunman. Your ranch." "We're all right," Evie said. He pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them. "I didn't know he was going to go that far. I swear to you that is true. I told myself it was just the deed, that you'd take the money and go, and nobody would be hurt." He stopped, "But it was never just the deed, no," she said. "He owns this farm," Elian said. "The note? He bought it from the bank in March. He came to me 2 weeks later, and said either I testified to what he needed or he foreclosed by the end of the month. He looked at his hands. Agnes, my boys. She waited. He looked up at her. His eyes had been holding something down for a long time, and it was coming up now regardless of whether he wanted it to. Your husband didn't die in an accident, he said. The kitchen went still. She held his eyes and waited. Montgomery wanted the spring 2 years ago, Elian said. Thomas wouldn't sell, same as you. So Montgomery sent a man out one night to the water trough, a compound, poisonous to cattle at the right concentration, enough to work through the water line over 2 weeks and wreck the herd without looking deliberate. He stopped, breathed. Thomas found the man doing it, in the dark. There was a fight. He looked at the table. Thomas didn't win it. The ordinary sounds of the morning came through the window. A wagon on the road, a bird somewhere in the tree line. Indifferent, the way mornings are. Evie sat with what she'd been told. She had lived alongside this possibility for 2 years, not examining it directly, because examining it required being certain about something she could do nothing with, and she had work to do, and a child to raise, and a spring to protect. But she had known, in the part of herself that didn't accept easy explanations, that Thomas's death had not been an accident. She had known, and she had kept moving because that was the only available option. She thought about Eli, 7 years old, and waking up to a world altered in the night. She thought about what 2 years of silence had cost him, what it had taken from him to lock himself that far inside himself, just to survive it. She thought about what she could do with this anger. She had used it carefully for 2 years. It had kept her standing and working. It had fueled every early morning and every long afternoon. But she could see, sitting at Elian Marsh's kitchen table, what would happen if she let it become something else. She had watched people pursue vengeance as though it were a destination. They arrived and found it empty, and were left with the emptiness, because the thing they had been chasing was never capable of returning what had been taken. Thomas was not coming back. No verdict was going to return him, but Eli was going to grow up, watching what she did next. She reached across the table and covered Elian's hands with both of hers. His hands were shaking. She held them. He stared at her. Fear made you a puppet for an evil man, she said. But remorse and courage today can give you back your human soul. Agnes, at the window, put one hand over her mouth. Elian Marsh's shoulders went in. He was not making much sound with it, but it moved through him in long, shuddering waves, 2 years of it, finding its way out, and she held his hands and said nothing, and gave him the time it needed. When he came back to himself, he reached into his shirt pocket. A folded document, worn at the creases, soft from being taken out, and replaced many times over a long period. He spread it open on the table between them. 3 pages, Montgomery Cattle and Land letterhead, an exclusive Army supply contract, terms detailed and specific, the spring water rights listed as a provisioning asset, and attached a separate sheet. A record of payments, Montgomery's personal account, an Army procurement officer's name and signature, kickbacks. Documented. Federal crimes outlined in his own letterhead and kept in a man's shirt pocket for 6 months. I took it from his office, Elian said. His voice was steadier now. He didn't know. I've had it since March. I kept taking it out and looking at it and putting it back. He looked at her hands still over his. I think I was waiting for someone to give it to. She picked up the document, folded it along its original creases, put it inside her jacket. I need you to stand in front of a judge, she said. Tell what you've told me today. Yes, it won't be comfortable. No, he looked at the window. Nothing about the last 2 years has been comfortable. She looked at him steadily. You have to live with what happened to Thomas. That's yours. I can't take it from you, and I won't pretend I can. But you can decide right now what the next thing you do is. Choose the right one. She stood and put her hat on. At the door, Agnes held it open for her, and Evie stopped on the step and turned. Agnes, she said, the farm isn't Montgomery's business yet. It won't be. She walked back to the tree line and found her horse and rode up out of the valley into the mountain light. with the contract flat against her chest inside her jacket, and the morning moving around her, clean and open, and hers to ride through. Thomas had been murdered for a spring he wouldn't give up. She had kept that spring. She had built 3 more years on it with her own hands, and she had the ledger, and she had the contract, and she had a frightened man who had found the edge of his courage on an ordinary morning in his own kitchen. She said goodbye to Thomas, properly, maybe for the first time, quietly, up in the pines where no one could hear it but the trees. Then she rode back to the cabin, back to the fire and the morning light, and Cale in the doorway, and Eli lining up stones on the step in the mountain air. She had everything she needed to finish this. Word travels differently among people who have nothing to lose. It doesn't go through newspapers or official channels or the mouths of men with offices. It goes through the morning shift change at a railroad camp, passed along in a cup of coffee. It goes in Spanish between vaqueros at a water trough on the western approach to town. It goes quietly, carefully between black freedmen who had learned 2 lifetimes ago to read the weather of powerful men's intentions well in advance of the storm. It went out over 5 days, come to Blackwood Basin. Evie and Cale sent it through Jensen the farrier, who had connections along the rail line, through a vaquero named Hector Cruz, who had worked the valley's ranches for 11 years and knew every man who had lost cattle or wages or land to Montgomery's expansion, through a freedman preacher named Samuel Graves, who ran a small church 4 miles south of town and had been watching Montgomery's methods for longer than most. They came on the 7th day. 23 people in total, Irish railroad hands, still carrying the calluses and the accents of Galway and Cork, vaqueros, who had ridden in from 2 counties over, their horses better than anything Montgomery's mercenaries owned. Black freedmen who had tried to homestead the eastern flats and had been systematically pushed out by inflated cattle fees and manufactured debt. 6 homesteader families from the western ridge who had lost grazing rights, water access, or both under Montgomery's legal maneuvering. They gathered in the yard at Blackwood Basin on a Tuesday morning, and Evie stood on the porch steps and looked at all of them, their faces, what they carried in those faces. She had a schoolteacher's instinct for reading a room, and what she read in this one was clear. These were not people who needed convincing that something was wrong. They had been living inside the wrongness for years. What they needed was a framework, a way to name it, and a path to address it. She began to speak. She talked about land rights as they existed under territorial law, not as theory, but as specific articles with specific numbers. She told them what the law actually said versus how men like Montgomery had been applying it. She explained the mechanisms: forged deeds, bought testimony, manufactured debt, used as a lever. She showed them her ledger and explained how she had documented 3 years of transactions in a way that cross-referenced to physical receipts, so that no single entry could be challenged without the entire chain of evidence coming with it. Documentation is not just bookkeeping, she said. It is armor. Every sale you make, every agreement you enter, every water right you use, put it in writing and keep the paper. A man can deny a conversation. He cannot deny a dated receipt with his signature on it. She talked about collective action, that Montgomery's power in this valley rested on isolation. He had gone after each of them separately, one ranch, one family, one community at a time, because people fighting alone are manageable. She told them what the same legal challenge looked like when 23 people filed it simultaneously, instead of one widow filing it alone. 2 of the homesteader men had legal questions she couldn't fully answer on the spot, and she told them so honestly, giving them the name and the address of a territorial lawyer in Abilene who charged a sliding fee based on income and had a record of representing exactly this kind of case. She did not pretend the path was easy. She told them it wasn't. She told them what it had cost her and what it was likely to cost them. And she did not soften that arithmetic, because these were adults who deserved accurate information rather than comfortable estimates. Then Cale took over. He had spent the previous 3 days sketching the property's defensive geography on a series of flat boards. He broke the group into smaller sections by terrain familiarity and went through each position. He was not training them to fight a standing battle with 40 mercenaries. He was training them to make this basin ungovernable at a cost that no rational hired force would sustain indefinitely. He showed them sight lines and angles. He taught them how to move in darkness without sound. He trained them in the mechanics of their own weapons for those who had them, and the defensive use of available terrain for those who didn't. He worked all morning. His shoulder was holding, but it was working at its limit, and he knew it. He knew it and kept going because the morning required him to. By mid-afternoon, they had started on fence repair at the southern end of the property, the storm damage, plus 2 weeks of neglect. It needed all of them. Heavy timber posts that the wind had laid flat needed to be lifted, set, and tamped. This required pairs on each post, and it required coordination. The longest of the fallen posts was on the corner, 12 feet of seasoned timber. Cale positioned himself at the base end, got his hands under it, and lifted. The shoulder gave, not catastrophically, but the wound at the back of it, imperfectly healed, took the full load and sent a white flash of pain through his arm and side that snapped his head back and dropped his knee to the dirt. He caught himself on one hand. The post hit the ground again. He crouched there with his right hand, pressed to the earth, and breathed through it. He was getting back up. Then a small body hit the post beside him. Eli had been working nearby, handing nails and carrying smaller materials in the focused, deliberate way he had been working all summer. Now he was at the post, both hands under it, shoulder against the wood, his whole body rigid with effort, his small face set and red, straining every available muscle against the weight of 12 feet of timber. He could not move it alone. He was 7 years old, but he was trying. Cale looked at the boy. Eli looked at him. His eyes were wet. His jaw was clenched. He pressed harder against the post. "Daddy," he said, out loud, clear and certain. The first word in 2 years, ringing out across the workyard so completely and suddenly that several of the men nearby went still and turned. "Hold on." Everything stopped. The yard was quiet. Cale did not move for a moment, his right hand still on the earth, his left arm at his side. He was looking at the boy. Then he got his feet under him and straightened up and put his hands back under the post, his left arm screaming. He lifted anyway. Samuel Graves stepped in on the other end, and Hector Cruz beside him, and 2 of the Irish hands took the middle, and the post came up. It went into the prepared hole clean and level, and 4 men tamped it with the iron bar, while Cale stood with his hands on the cross rail, breathing deliberately. Eli was still beside him, still pressed against the post with his palms flat on the wood. Cale looked down at him. "Good thinking," he said. "Thank you, son." The word came out quietly. He hadn't planned it. It just was what it was. Eli turned and wrapped both arms around Cale's waist and pressed his face against his side. Cale's right hand came down and rested on top of the boy's head. From across the yard, Evie stood watching. She held completely still. She did not trust herself to speak, and she didn't try. She pressed her fingers against her lips and looked at those 2 in the afternoon light, and let the moment be what it was. A woman named Clara Donahue, wife of one of the Irish hands, put her arm around Evie's shoulders without saying a word. The fence work went on. They finished by evening and ate together in the basin. As the light went gold on the ridge, and the first real clouds in 6 weeks moved in from the northwest, it might rain soon. Judge Anselm Rhodes held territorial court in the same building as the land registry, once a month on the last Wednesday. He was 61, originally from Ohio, and had presided over enough land disputes to recognize the difference between law being applied and law being used as a weapon by men who could afford to rent it. He arrived on a Wednesday morning with his ledger under his arm and his clerk behind him and said nothing until he was seated. The courtroom held 30 people. Every available chair was filled. Irish hands, vaqueros, freedmen, homesteaders. They had come down from the basin and filled the room quietly and waited. Evie stood at the petitioner's table in her best dress with the tin box on the wood beside her, and Elian Marsh to her left. His hands were clasped and still. He had shaved that morning. He was pale, but he was present, and his chin was level. Montgomery's attorney sat across the aisle, with the forged deed in a leather folder. Sheriff Pike occupied a chair along the wall, with the practiced arrangement of a man performing official impartiality. The judge read the filed briefs. He took his time. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of turning pages. Meanwhile, 8 miles north at Blackwood Basin, Montgomery was moving. He had taken what remained of his hired force, 11 men, the ones still willing to work for reduced pay, after the storm debacle, and come to the ranch in the early morning, before the valley was fully awake. His calculation was straightforward. If the original evidence stored at the ranch could be destroyed, a partial document case was harder to prosecute. Whatever Elian had taken, whatever Evie had kept in her ledger, physical receipts in a tin box could burn. He came through the gate at dawn. The basin was quiet. He got to the barn door before Hector Cruz stepped out from the shadow of the water tank to his left, a rifle across his chest, easy and certain, and from the right, 2 of the Irish hands. And from the south fence line, Samuel Graves, with 3 of the homesteader men behind him, positioned at the posts Eli had helped raise the week before. Cale came from the barn door. His left arm was in a cloth sling. He had the Colt in his right hand, relaxed at his side. He looked at Montgomery and the 11 men strung out behind him, and he did not say a word. He didn't need to. The math was immediate and visible. 11 men, looking at 16 people, positioned across every exit angle of the property they had ridden into. People who knew every inch of the ground they were standing on. The 11 men looked at each other, then at their exits, then at each other again. One by one, they put their weapons down. In the courtroom, Evie opened the tin box. She placed the ledger on the judge's bench with both hands flat beside it, as steady as she had been, the morning she'd cleaned a bullet out of a man's shoulder by lantern light. "Your Honor," she said, "this ledger documents 3 years and 4 months of continuous operation at Blackwood Basin Ranch, cross-referenced to physical receipts stored in this box. Every transaction, every date, including May 14th, which places me in Harlan at Hewitt's Mercantile and the adjoining livery stable for the entire morning, during which the opposing party claims I was present at my property to receive payment and execute a deed." She set the mercantile receipt beside the ledger, the livery record beside that. She looked at Elian Marsh. Elian stood. He testified for 11 minutes. He spoke clearly and did not look away from the judge. He described the coercion, the note Montgomery held on his farm, the forged deed. He described what he knew about Thomas Callahan's death. His voice broke once, near the end, and he stopped for a moment and then continued. When he finished, he placed the contract on the bench. 3 pages. Montgomery cattle and land letterhead. The Army procurement kickbacks in detailed writing. Evie stepped forward. She looked at the courtroom. 30 people, plus the judge, plus Pike at the wall with his badge going dull, Your Honor, she said. "I want to speak to something beyond the specific facts of this case." The judge looked at her and nodded. She turned to face the room. "This West was built not just by the guns of men," she said, "but by the blood, sweat, and intellect of women. Water belongs to the source of life. It does not belong to the greed of powerful men." She let that sit. The spring at Blackwood Basin has been documented, maintained, and defended by a woman for 3 years. I kept records because I was a schoolteacher who understood that truth requires evidence. I kept records because I knew that in a dispute, a widow's word would be challenged first and believed last. I kept those records before any dispute existed, without any foreknowledge that they would be needed, which is precisely why they are valid. She looked at the judge directly. Every person in this room who works this land, who hauls water, who raises cattle and children and communities in this territory deserves equal standing under the law, regardless of their sex, their nation of origin, or the language they grew up speaking. That is not a political argument. It is the only logical foundation on which any of the rest of this law is worth the paper it's written on. The room was quiet. The judge looked at his bench for a moment, then at the ledger, then at the contract, then at Pike. He wrote for approximately 4 minutes. He looked up. The deed of sale filed by Montgomery Cattle and land is voided as fraudulent. The eviction order attached to it is vacated. Title to Blackwood Basin Ranch, including water rights to the spring therein, remains with Evelyn Callahan. He set his pen down. Furthermore, based on the documentary evidence submitted in these proceedings, this court issues arrest warrants for Thaddeus Montgomery and Sheriff Orson Pike on charges of forgery, land fraud, suborning perjury, and conspiracy in connection with the murder of Thomas Callahan. The federal contract evidence will be forwarded to the appropriate United States authority. He picked up his pen again and began writing. In the courtroom, someone began to applaud. Then more, then all 30 of them at once. Evie stood at the petitioner's table, with her hands on the tin box, and her back straight, and her face composed. Elian Marsh sat beside her with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and left it there. 8 miles north, Cale accepted Montgomery's pistol from the man's own hand and passed it to Hector Cruz without looking at it. The charges arrived by rider before noon. Montgomery went into chains in the basin yard. His hired men were released on their word to leave the territory, and they did immediately and without objection. 2 hours later, a deputy from a neighboring county arrived in Harlan to collect Pike. It was over. The first rain came that Thursday. Not a dust-chasing sprinkle, but a real rain, persistent and thorough, the kind that saturates down past the surface and reaches the root level. It came in the afternoon and was still going by evening. And when Evie stood on the porch and put her hand out into it, she left it there for a long time. The basin flooded slowly and gratefully. The creek ran brown and then ran clear. People came the next morning to help rebuild. It started with the people from the courtroom, the ones who had been in the basin working fences 2 weeks before. They brought tools and lumber and food. Then word spread in the way it had spread the first time, through the rail yard shift change and the Vaquero Network and Samuel Graves's congregation. And more came. By Saturday, there were over 60 people on the property. They rebuilt the burned doorframe on the barn first, then the damaged fence sections. Then they turned their attention to a second project, one Evie had described to 3 people in quiet conversation the day after the verdict, and that had apparently traveled across the valley in 48 hours on its own. The small building had been a storage room attached to the barn's north wall, dry and sheltered, and large enough for 12 people to sit in without crowding. By Sunday afternoon, it had a new floor, 4 clean windows, and 2 long tables built from salvaged timber. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. 12 chairs around the 2 tables, a chalkboard along the south wall, salvaged from the old school in Harlan that had closed in the spring when the drought took the funding with it, a shelf for books, half of which she already owned, and the other half of which were promised by a woman from the Irish settlement who had been a schoolteacher in Dublin before emigrating. She would open it on Monday. She would teach reading first, then basic writing, then legal literacy, the specific documents that affected the lives of people in this territory, deed language, water rights filings, employment contracts, how to read them and what to look for, and what the specific phrases meant when a man with money put them in front of you and asked you to sign. Every child in the territory had the right to that knowledge, regardless of what language their parents spoke at home or where their people had come from. She had been a school teacher for 6 years, and she had given that gift in one small corner of Connecticut, and she intended to give it here with the remainder of her working life. The school was free. Eli stood beside her in the doorway and looked at the room. He had been speaking for 2 weeks now, carefully, selectively, building back into language the way he had built his stone lines, one piece at a time, with great attention to placement. He spoke to Cale most, then to Evie, then to Hector Cruz's youngest, a boy his own age named Miguel, who had arrived the previous Saturday, and with whom he had been conducting an ongoing, largely nonverbal friendship based around a collection of particularly good stones. "Will Miguel come?" Eli asked. "Yes," she said, "and his sister, and the Donahue children, and Samuel Graves's grandchildren." He considered this. "Will I have to stop doing fence work?" "Only in the mornings." He nodded, satisfied with that arrangement, and went to find Miguel. That evening, Cale came in from the barn at the end of the day and stood in the kitchen and took both colts from the belt and carried them to the far wall. He lifted them to the 2 iron pegs she had driven there that morning. He hung them, stepped back. He looked at them for a moment, the way a man looks at something that has been part of his daily weight for so long that he has to consciously feel the absence of it and decide what he thinks about that. He decided he was all right with it. He turned from the wall and saw Evie in the doorway to the kitchen. She was watching him. She didn't say anything. He came to the kitchen and sat down. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and they talked about the fence work still needed on the South Line and the school schedule for Monday morning, and whether the rain would hold through the weekend. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the sky above the basin came up amber and clear. From the east, they married under the cottonwood at the edge of the yard. The tree had leafed back out after the rain. It stood in its full green weight above them, and the light came through the leaves and moved on the ground. Samuel Graves officiated. He had a good voice for the occasion, steady and warm, and he didn't use more words than the moment needed. The community was there, Irish and Mexican, and black and homesteader, shoulder to shoulder in the early light. Eli stood to Cale's left, his flat white stone in his pocket. Cale took Evie's hands. He was not good at speeches, and they both knew this, and neither of them minded. He had written 3 sentences on a piece of paper, and practiced them enough that he could say them without the paper. "I don't claim you," he said, "and I don't ask you to claim me. I ask to walk beside you, in full partnership and full respect, for as long as we're standing." She looked at him. The light was moving in the leaves above them. "Beside you," she said. "Equal partners in freedom. That is the whole of it, and it is enough." Samuel Graves said what he needed to say. And they were married. He pulled the flat white stone from his pocket and placed it on the ground between their feet, carefully aligned with some private geometry of his own. Then he looked up at Cale with an expression of complete and open certainty. Cale crouched down, met his eyes. "Good placement," he said. Eli smiled, full and unguarded. The kind of smile that had been waiting 2 years for a morning, worth spending it on. The spring ran cold and clean at the back of the property through the new washed stone. The school would open Monday. The guns were on the wall. The ledger was in the tin box on the kitchen shelf, its work done, its record complete. What Montgomery had tried to take by force, a spring and the land around it, and the rights of a woman who would not be moved, had outlasted him in every way. He had operated from the premise that power was the only language the frontier understood. He had been wrong. What had roots here now, in the soil of Blackwood Basin, was something older and more stubborn than power. It was the belief that every human being arrived with inherent dignity, that no deed and no gun and no bought verdict could permanently overwrite that fact, and that when people stopped being afraid of each other and started standing in the same yard, that belief became a force that money couldn't hire, and no bounty could capture. It built. That was what it did. The community walked away from the cottonwood into the amber morning, talking about Monday and school and the south fence and what the rain had done to the east approach road. Ordinary things. The things that a life is actually made of when the crisis is over and the real work begins. The spring ran on. Before we leave Blackwood Basin, I want to sit with you here for just a moment, because this story wasn't really about a spring of water, or a forged deed, or 40 hired guns on a dusty road. It was about something quieter and harder and more lasting than any of that. It was about what a person chooses to do when everything around them is drying up. Evie Callahan didn't survive that summer because she was lucky. She survived because she had spent years building something that no one could take from her, not a deed, not a court order, not $1,000 bounty. She had built knowledge. She had built documentation. She had built the habit of recording the truth before anyone told her the truth would be needed. And when the storm came, all of that preparation became the foundation she stood on. There is a lesson in that for every one of us. The records you keep today, the agreements you put in writing, the receipts you file away, they are not bureaucratic tedium. They are armor. And the time to build armor is before the battle arrives, not during it. Cale Ross taught us something different. He taught us that a man's history does not have to be his destiny. He carried the weight of a name, the ghost of Sweetwater, earned through years of work he was no longer proud of. And every time he had the chance to fall back on that old violence, he chose something harder. He chose restraint. He chose precision over destruction. He chose to protect rather than to dominate. That is not weakness. That is the most difficult kind of strength there is, the kind that nobody applauds in the moment and everybody recognizes years later. And then there is Eli, 7 years old, 2 years of silence. A child who had seen something no child should see and who locked himself away inside that silence because the world had become too loud and too dangerous to speak into. He didn't find his voice again because someone forced it out of him. He found it because a man showed up and worked quietly beside him, day after day, without demand or performance or expectation. He found it because safety was built slowly, one fence post and one shared meal at a time. Trust cannot be rushed. It can only be earned, and when it is genuinely earned, even the most wounded people will eventually reach toward it. What Evie built at Blackwood Basin, in the end, was not just a ranch with a school attached. It was proof that violence can seize things temporarily, but it cannot hold them. Greed can manufacture a deed and buy a sheriff and assemble 40 armed men, and it will still lose to a woman with 3 years of accurate receipts and a community that finally stopped being afraid of each other. That is not a fairy tale. That is how justice has always actually moved, slowly, on paper, through people willing to stand together and tell the truth out loud in rooms where it is uncomfortable to hear. If this story gave you something today, a little courage, a reminder to document your own life more carefully, a reason to extend grace to someone who made a wrong choice out of fear, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Stories set in the past have always been letters written to the present. This one is no different. Thank you for riding this trail with me. If Blackwood Basin felt like home to you, hit subscribe and stay close, because there are more stories like this one waiting just over the ridge. Leave me a comment and tell me what stayed with you longest. I read every single one. I'll see you at the next campfire. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real historical events is coincidental.